Jim Bakker's life began far from the bright studio lights, applause, and stadium-sized crowds that would one day surround him. Born in Muskegon, Michigan, in 1940, he grew up in a modest household, raised by parents who taught him the foundations of faith, but never imagined the magnitude of his future influence or the depth of the scandal that would one day destroy it. In many ways, Bakker started as the kind of young man church communities celebrated, charismatic, enthusiastic, and driven by what seemed like a sincere desire to spread the gospel. When he met Tammy Faye Lavelli at North Central Bible College, they became inseparable. Both possessed a knack for capturing attention. Jim with his boyish charm and Tammy with her unmistakable voice and theatrical personality. They dropped out of college, married, and embarked on a ministry path that felt unstoppable. Their earliest years were humble, filled with small church visits, puppet shows for children, and evangelistic tours across Midwestern towns. But something about the Bakkers connected with people. Their chemistry was magnetic, and soon major Christian networks began to notice. Their big break came in the early 1960s when they joined Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network. The Bakkers pioneered a children's show, then a late-night Christian talk show. Jim's smooth delivery and effortless crowd rapport made him a natural television host. Tammy's emotional singing and expressive personality made her memorable, even iconic. The couple became loved by millions of viewers. Jim Bakker wasn't satisfied with being a supporting figure. His ambitions grew rapidly. He envisioned an empire Christian media network that rivaled secular television, a place where faith, entertainment, and fundraising could merge into something massive. In 1974, he founded the PTL network. Praise the Lord. To Christian viewers, it felt like a revolution. Bakker introduced talk shows, musical performances, prayer hours, telethons, and celebrity guests. He brought show business energy into religious programming, transforming spirituality into a full-blown broadcast spectacle. PTL's success exploded. Donations poured in $1 million a week at its peak. Jim and Tammy became household names. Their smiles became synonymous with Christian hope. But behind the polished broadcasts, the seeds of Bakker's downfall were already beginning to grow. Bakker believed he was favored by God, and he believed prosperity, especially financial prosperity, was a visible sign of divine approval. This mindset fed a dangerous loop. The more money PTL made, the more Bakker felt justified in spending. His leadership moved from ministry to corporate empire building. Luxury became not a temptation, but a lifestyle. PTL's headquarters, Heritage Village, became a sprawling complex of offices, studios, restaurants, and eventually an entire theme park. Heritage USA. It featured hotels, water parks, biblical attractions, and a Christian Disneyland atmosphere. It cost hundreds of millions. Bakker justified it as a place where families could be spiritually renewed. But the finances behind the scenes were becoming catastrophic. Staff members began noticing troubling patterns. Money was spent freely, without oversight. Donations intended for missions or community support were funneled into construction, staff salaries, and executive perks. Clerks reported missing receipts, creative accounting entries, and pressures to hide deficits. But criticizing Bakker inside PTL was nearly unthinkable. Employees feared losing their jobs or worse, being accused of attacking God's work. The first public crack appeared in 1985 when the IRS found PTL owed millions in taxes. Bakker dismissed the issue as bureaucratic harassment, but internally, auditors warned that Heritage USA was drowning in debt. Bakker refused to slow down. He pushed harder, launching new fundraising drives, creating lifetime partnership programs, and promising donors extravagant rewards. These partnerships would become the core of the fraud case. For a $1,000 donation, supporters were guaranteed annual stays at Heritage Village hotels, rooms that didn't exist in the numbers sold. PTL oversold the program by tens of thousands of memberships. Even if they tried to honor the promises, Heritage Village couldn't physically accommodate the number of donors. PTL was collapsing under its own weight, but Bakker kept announcing blessings, breakthroughs, and divine expansions. The turning point came from a scandal that did not originate with financial deceit, but with a human tragedy, the story of Jessica Hahn. In 1980, Hahn was a 21-year-old church secretary, working for a pastor affiliated with PTL. She traveled to meet Bakker for what she believed was a ministry-related event. Instead, she later testified, Bakker pressured her into a sexual encounter, after which she was paid to remain silent. PTL executives arranged the payout of $250,000 using donor money disguised as operational expenses. When the story reached the media in 1987, it ignited instantly. Newspapers exposed the hush money. Former employees stepped forward, alleging long-standing financial mismanagement. The IRS began digging again. The FBI followed. PTL's internal documents began to surface, revealing years of hidden spending: private jets, gold bathroom fixtures, luxury homes, jewelry, and enormous bonuses for Bakker and top executives. The public felt betrayed. Millions had sent money believing they were supporting God's kingdom, not funding a lifestyle of excess. In March 1987, under growing pressure, Jim Bakker resigned from PTL. His televised resignation was an emotional display. He streamed down Tammy's cheeks. Jim blamed enemies, satanic attacks, and misunderstandings, but the investigations were far from finished. Federal prosecutors soon assembled one of the largest fraud cases in televangelism history. The evidence was staggering. Bakker had oversold $158 million worth of partnerships for rooms that didn't exist. He had diverted millions into secret accounts. He had falsified financial reports and used ministry funds for personal luxuries. More than 24 criminal counts were filed against him, including wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy. The 1989 trial was sensational. The courtroom packed with reporters, churchgoers, supporters, critics, and former staff. Tammy attended with heavy makeup and emotional expressions that tabloids turned into caricatures. Jim, once confident on television, now looked fragile, sweating, trembling, and often breaking down. Prosecutors argued that Bakker had knowingly deceived his followers. They presented shredded documents salvaged from PTL offices, testimonies from accountants pressured to falsify numbers, and donor statements expressing heartbreak. The prosecution painted a picture of a man consumed by greed who built an empire on lies. The defense tried to reframe Bakker as overwhelmed, emotional, and too trusting of advisors. They argued he wasn't a conman, just a naive dreamer who let PTL grow beyond his control. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury found him guilty on all major counts. The judge sentenced him to 45 years in federal prison and fined him $500,000. The courtroom gasped. Tammy collapsed, crying. Jim was led away in handcuffs, face ashen, the weight of years of deception finally crashing down on him. In prison, Bakker struggled physically and mentally. He suffered panic attacks, depression, and overwhelming guilt. But years later, after appeals, his sentence was reduced to 18 years. He was paroled after serving about 5. When Bakker emerged from prison in 1994, Tammy Faye had left him. PTL was gone. The empire had crumbled, but he still had supporters, people who believed he had been targeted unfairly. Slowly, he rebuilt a smaller ministry, publishing books and returning to Christian broadcasting with a more apocalyptic message. To critics, Bakker never fully owned the harm he caused. To loyalists, he was a redeemed man who had survived persecution. To victims, donors who lost life savings, staff who lost jobs, families whose faith was shaken, the wounds lingered. Decades later, the scandal remains one of the largest religious fraud cases in American history. It reshaped public trust. It led to stronger regulations for religious nonprofits. It changed how millions viewed televangelism. But the deeper reflection remains haunting. How does a preacher, adored by millions, lose himself so completely in the world he built? Was the empire corrupt from the beginning, or did power, money, and unchecked authority slowly transform a minister into a mastermind of financial deception? And most chilling of all, how many people today still trust leaders who walk the same dangerous road? He called himself a prophet, a chosen messenger of God. To his followers, Tony Alamo was more than a preacher. He was a savior in a dark world, a man who claimed to hear the divine voice and promised eternal life to anyone who obeyed him. But what lay beneath his holy words was a nightmare of manipulation, greed, and unthinkable abuse. Tony Alamo built an empire of fear disguised as faith, and behind the closed doors of his ministry, he created a world where religion was weaponized to control, exploit, and destroy. Tony Alamo's story began like many cult leaders before him, with charm, conviction, and the perfect pitch for salvation. Born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in Joplin, Missouri, in 1934, Alamo moved to California in the 1960s, chasing fame as a pop singer. When that failed, he reinvented himself as a man of God, claiming that Jesus had appeared to him and called him to spread his word. It was during this rebirth that he met Susan Lipowitz, a woman as ambitious and controlling as he was. Together, they founded the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation in 1969. Headquartered in Hollywood, what began as a small street ministry for runaways and addicts quickly grew into something far more sinister. The Alamos promised spiritual freedom but demanded absolute obedience. Their followers were told to sever ties with their families, surrender their possessions, and dedicate their lives to the church. Those who questioned them were shamed, beaten, or excommunicated. By the mid-1970s, the foundation had relocated to Dyer, Arkansas, where it blossomed into a self-contained community. The Alamos preached daily, broadcast sermons, and ran businesses ranging from construction to clothing manufacturing, all using unpaid labor from their followers. The money poured in, and Tony's control deepened. When Susan died in 1982, something in Tony snapped. He declared that she would be resurrected and ordered followers to pray over her corpse for 6 months, refusing to bury her until the stench became unbearable. He began referring to himself as both prophet and God, claiming Susan spoke to him from heaven. He used fear and scripture to justify every cruelty. Women were told to submit, children were told to obey without question, and anyone who doubted was labeled possessed by demons. Over the next 2 decades, Tony Alamo's ministry evolved into a cult-like compound governed by violence and paranoia. Former followers later described beatings with wooden boards, starvation punishments, and forced labor. Children worked long hours in church businesses, were pulled from school, and taught that the outside world was evil. Alamo's sermons became more apocalyptic and erratic, filled with rants against Catholics, Jews, and the U.S. government he claimed to be preparing for the end times, building what he called God's kingdom on earth. But behind this divine facade, he was living in depravity, taking underage girls as his spiritual wives. In the 1990s, reports began surfacing that Alamo was forcing young girls, some as young as 9, into marriages with him. He justified it by citing biblical patriarchs who had many wives. Survivors later revealed that he would hold mock wedding ceremonies, declaring the girls his brides and subjecting them to sexual abuse. Parents who resisted were punished, sometimes beaten in front of their children. Federal authorities began investigating, but Alamo was adept at evasion. In 1994, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 6 years in prison after being found guilty of hiding millions in church funds. When he was released in 1998, he rebuilt his ministry, smaller but just as dangerous. His compound in Fuke, Arkansas, became the center of renewed allegations of abuse. Former followers who escaped spoke of nightmarish conditions of children whipped for minor offenses, of forced fasts that lasted days, and of women kept in fear of eternal damnation. In 2008, the FBI raided the compound. What they found confirmed the horrifying rumors, evidence of child sexual abuse, physical punishment, and control so total it bordered on psychological slavery. 6 women came forward, describing how Alamo had taken them as child brides and assaulted them repeatedly. Some were as young as 8 when the abuse began. During his 2009 trial, prosecutors called him a predator who used the Bible as a weapon. The survivors told harrowing stories of manipulation, how Alamo convinced them that sexual acts were holy, and that disobedience would bring God's wrath. One victim testified that he forced her to marry him when she was just 9, taking her on trips where he would rape her in hotel rooms. Another said he told her she was chosen by God and would be cursed if she ever told anyone. The courtroom heard hours of testimony detailing not just sexual abuse but decades of terror inflicted under the guise of religion. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict Tony Alamo on 10 counts of transporting minors across state lines for sex. He was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. The judge called him beyond redemption. Even then, Alamo showed no remorse. In his statement, he railed against the government, claiming he was being persecuted for his faith. To the end, he believed himself untouchable, a prophet above man's law. Tony Alamo died in 2017 in a North Carolina prison at the age of 82. His death closed a chapter in one of the darkest sagas of American evangelical history. But for his victims, the trauma lingers. Many former members still struggle to rebuild their lives after years of indoctrination and abuse. Some remain estranged from family members who are still loyal to Alamo's teachings. Even after his death, remnants of his ministry continued online, spreading his sermons and insisting he was framed by the government. What makes Tony Alamo's story especially chilling is how he turned faith, something meant to heal and uplift, into a tool for domination. He convinced parents to surrender their children, turned prayer into punishment, and built wealth on the backs of those he enslaved spiritually and physically. His followers believed they were serving God. In truth, they were serving a man who saw himself as one. Alamo's legacy is not one of faith, but of fear, a cautionary reminder that charisma without conscience becomes tyranny. He wore religion like armor, using it to deflect every accusation, manipulate every heart, and justify every sin. And yet, for decades, the world looked away, blinded by his rhetoric, comforted by the illusion that a man who preached the Bible could not possibly be evil. But evil often hides behind the holiest masks, and Tony Alamos was one that promised salvation, but delivered hell instead. Paul Jennings Hill's story is one of faith gone fatally astray. Born in 1954 in Miami, Florida, Hill grew up in a devout Christian family, the kind of household where prayer, Bible study, and church attendance were daily rituals. By all accounts, he was a bright, disciplined, and earnest young man destined to lead a life devoted to God. But beneath the quiet upbringing was a mind increasingly consumed by ideology, an ideology that would eventually justify murder in his eyes. Hill's path to the pulpit was conventional at first. He studied theology, attended seminary, and became a Presbyterian minister. He married, had children, and became a respected figure in his community. Parishioners praised his sermons, noting the intensity with which he spoke about morality, sin, and the sanctity of life. At first, Hill's radical tendencies were subtle and extreme anti-abortion stance, fiery rhetoric during sermons, and frequent warnings of impending divine judgment. Over the years, Hill's beliefs grew more extreme. He began associating with radical anti-abortion activists, reading pamphlets and newsletters that endorsed direct action against those providing abortions. To Hill, these writers weren't just advocating protest, they were issuing a divine call to arms. Friends noticed his obsession. He spent hours studying religious texts and radical tracts, interpreting scripture to justify acts that mainstream society would consider criminal. By the early 1990s, Hill's worldview had become rigid, violent, and uncompromising. He preached not just against abortion, but against anyone he believed was complicit in sin. To him, moral transgression demanded divine retribution, sometimes by mortal hands. Parishioners noticed an increasing tension in his sermons, the intensity of his rhetoric, warning of a coming judgment that only he seemed able to carry out. On the morning of July 29, 1994, Hill's radical ideology became real. Armed with a 12-gauge shotgun, he drove to the Ladies' Center Clinic in Pensacola, Florida, a small abortion clinic that had served the community for years. Inside were Dr. John Britton, a physician dedicated to providing medical services including abortions, and his volunteer bodyguard, James Barrett. Witnesses later described Hill walking calmly into the parking lot, shotgun in hand, with a chilling sense of purpose. Without hesitation, Hill opened fire. Britton was killed instantly. Barrett, the volunteer protecting the doctor, was also shot and killed. Barrett's wife, present during the attack, was gravely injured. The violence was sudden, unprovoked in the sense that there had been no personal conflict. This was an act Hill framed as divine mission. When police arrived, Hill did not resist arrest. He calmly surrendered, telling authorities he had obeyed God. The investigation was straightforward but shocking. Multiple witnesses, including patients and passers-by, provided accounts of the shootings. Physical evidence confirmed Hill's presence, and the deliberate nature of the attack was indisputable. Law enforcement quickly connected his actions to his radical anti-abortion activism and the extremist literature he had consumed. During his trial, Hill remained unapologetic. He argued that the murders were justified, that he had a moral obligation to stop what he considered a greater evil. Prosecutors presented a harrowing portrait of a man who had methodically planned murder as a form of religious duty. They highlighted prior statements in sermons, his association with extremist groups, and meticulous preparations to avoid capture. Hill's defense tried to paint him as mentally unbalanced, but Hill himself denied any mental illness. To him, his actions were righteous. The courtroom was tense, filled with media, supporters, critics, and the families of the victims. Emotional testimony detailed the lives taken and the terror inflicted. Survivors and witnesses recounted the moments of the shooting with chilling clarity, underscoring the stark reality of religious extremism crossing into lethal action. The jury deliberated and found Hill guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death, a punishment reflecting both the severity of his crimes and the deliberate, premeditated nature of his actions. In the years that followed, Hill became a controversial figure. Some extremists lauded him as a martyr. Others, including religious communities and anti-violence advocates, condemned him unequivocally. Hill was executed on September 3, 2003, by lethal injection. Outside the prison, protesters clashed with media, some holding signs calling him a hero, others mourning the loss of innocent lives. The execution marked the end of a life that had been increasingly consumed by a violent ideology and a distorted sense of divine justice. The aftermath of Hill's actions rippled far beyond the immediate victims. Communities debated the boundaries of religious belief, the responsibilities of clergy, and the danger of radicalization. Seminaries and churches examined how rhetoric could influence followers toward violence, and how ideology could warp even seemingly pious individuals into agents of terror. Counseling programs for extremist prevention cited Hill's case as a study in the escalation of radical thought to lethal action. For survivors and family members, the emotional toll was profound. James Barrett's widow and friends of Dr. Britton carried trauma, grief, and anger, struggling to reconcile the faith-driven rhetoric that motivated Hill with the tangible horror of their loss. Advocacy groups formed to protect clinic staff and educate the public about the risks of extremist violence, hoping to prevent future tragedies. The chilling reflection left by Paul Hill's story remains. What happens when a man of God believes murder is a sacred duty? How do communities safeguard against religious extremism, and how can faith, a force that inspires hope, become a justification for violence? Hill's life and actions are a somber reminder that devout belief, unchecked by ethical boundaries and human compassion, can lead to a moral abyss. The line between conviction and fanaticism is sometimes perilously thinned. For those caught in its grip, the consequences can be deadly. Lehman Chapel's story begins like that of many respected religious leaders' humble origins, a calling to serve God and an outward appearance of compassion and morality. Born in Missouri in the mid-20th century, Chapel grew up attending local churches, eventually feeling a divine pull toward the ministry. By the time he reached adulthood, he was a charismatic figure, known for his calm demeanor, eloquent sermons, and genuine interest in the spiritual well-being of his congregation. Families trusted him implicitly, and teenagers confided in him, seeing in Chapel a guide and mentor, someone who could navigate the challenges of adolescence with wisdom and kindness. Chapel's rise within the church was steady. He worked as a youth pastor, then moved on to senior pastoral roles, building a reputation as a leader who emphasized community, engagement, morality, and family values. His sermons often highlighted the dangers of temptation, sin, and worldly distractions. Parishioners described his voice as soothing, yet compelling, a rare combination that drew in listeners and created a strong sense of loyalty. To the public, Chapel's life was exemplary. He appeared devoted to his family, involved in local charities, and attentive to the church expanded under his leadership. Youth programs flourished. Parents felt safe sending their children to Chapel's guidance, believing he was a moral compass in a complicated world. No one suspected the dark reality that existed behind closed doors. The first signs of misconduct were subtle and easily dismissed by outsiders. Young teenagers, especially girls, reported feeling uneasy after private counseling sessions with Chapel. Late-night meetings, extended mentorship hours, and personal visits to parishioners' homes were normalized within the church structure as part of spiritual guidance. Many parents trusted that their children were in good hands. After all, this was a man who wore the mantle of God's authority, whose reputation was impeccable, and whose charisma made objections seem unreasonable. The abuse began in secrecy. Chapel gradually crossed lines, using his position of authority to manipulate and control vulnerable congregants. Victims described an insidious pattern: personal attention that seemed caring at first, followed by coercion, intimidation, and the gradual introduction of sexual exploitation. Those who resisted were threatened with spiritual punishment claims that God would condemn them if they failed to obey his instructions. The grooming process was meticulous, calculated, and psychologically devastating. Over time, Chapel's predation escalated. He produced and possessed child exploitation material, documenting the abuse he inflicted. These acts were concealed behind encrypted storage, hidden drives, and careful operational secrecy. He was methodical, ensuring that no evidence would easily surface. At the same time, he maintained the illusion of normalcy within the church, continuing to lead services, provide spiritual counseling, and engage in community activities. This duality made it difficult for authorities and parishioners to suspect wrongdoing. Chappell's manipulation extended beyond the immediate victims. Families were often kept in the dark, believing that their children were receiving special mentorship or guidance. Teenagers were made to feel complicit or responsible for any consequences, deepening the psychological grip. Friends and staff were sometimes coerced into complicity, either through fear or the manipulative framing that opposing Chappell was opposing God. The entire ecosystem of the church became a trap, isolating victims and silencing potential whistleblowers. In 2015, the first public crack in this carefully constructed facade occurred. A teenager bravely reported suspicious interactions to local authorities. Her account included private meetings that involved inappropriate touching, coercive behavior, and threats framed as religious doctrine. Investigators obtained warrants, searched Chappell's home, and uncovered a trove of child exploitation material. The evidence confirmed the victim's story and revealed a pattern of abuse spanning years, possibly decades. Hidden drives contained hundreds of images depicting the exploitation of children within his congregation. The betrayal was staggering. The man families trusted most had used that trust to commit egregious acts. Federal prosecutors quickly charged Chappell with multiple counts of producing and possessing child exploitation material. The courtroom became a stage for a moral reckoning. Families who once sang hymns under his leadership now confronted the horrifying truth of his actions. Victims courageously testified, describing in painstaking detail the abuse, manipulation, and trauma inflicted by the man who had claimed spiritual authority. Their voices, full of pain and courage, exposed a deeply systemic pattern of predation. During the trial, Chappell's defense attempted to minimize the abuse, framing the incidents as isolated or misinterpreted. Prosecutors countered by detailing the deliberate, premeditated nature of his crimes, emphasizing the extensive documentation and repeated victimization. Witnesses recounted late-night visits, coercion tactics, and the psychological manipulation used to maintain control over children and families. The narrative painted a picture of a double life, one man publicly preaching morality, the other secretly exploiting the most vulnerable. In 2016, Chappell was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. The sentence reflected not only the scale of his crimes, but the betrayal of trust inherent in his position as a pastor. The community, once unified under his leadership, fractured in the aftermath. Families moved away, seeking distance from the trauma. Congregants dissolved the church, unable to reconcile their faith with the deception of their spiritual leader. The emotional and spiritual toll rippled far beyond the immediate victims, affecting an entire community. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Many faced long-term trauma, including anxiety, depression, and difficulty trusting authority figures. Therapy, support groups, and legal restitution became essential tools in the slow process of healing. Even as Chappell served his sentence, the shadow of his actions continued to loom over the lives he had corrupted. The legacy of Lehman Chappell's crimes is more than a legal case. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority, charisma, and the misuse of religious trust. His story illustrates the vulnerability of communities that place absolute faith in spiritual leaders without oversight. It exposes the potential for harm when authority is exploited and reminds society that vigilance, transparency, and accountability are essential to protect the most vulnerable. The reflection left by Chappell's story is haunting and enduring. How do communities heal when the shepherd is the predator? How do we reconcile faith with betrayal? And what safeguards are necessary to ensure that trust is never exploited again? Even today, survivors continue to rebuild their lives, carrying the weight of the past while striving to reclaim agency and trust. The story of Lehman Chappell stands as a stark reminder that evil often hides behind the most comforting facades, and that vigilance, courage, and accountability are vital in the face of such deception. Gerald H. Hill's story begins, like many tales of charismatic religious leadership, a man devoted to God, respected in his community, and admired for his intellect and eloquence. Born in the United States in the early 1950s, Hill grew up in a household that valued faith, discipline, and service. As a child he was shy yet intelligent, excelling in school and participating in church activities. By adolescence, he had embraced the idea of a life dedicated to spiritual leadership, believing that he was called to guide others along the righteous path. Hill's early adulthood followed a predictable religious trajectory. He attended seminary, where his academic talents and natural charisma set him apart. Professors noted his ability to interpret scripture with authority, to command attention in a classroom, and to inspire others with his words. He married young and became deeply involved in his local church community, eventually ascending to pastoral leadership. At first glance, Hill's life was one of devotion, service, and moral guidance, a model of clerical integrity. As his ministry grew, so did his influence. Hill became known for his moving sermons, his ability to counsel troubled youth, and his leadership in community outreach programs. Parents entrusted their children to his guidance. Church members relied on his moral clarity, and his reputation as a scholar and preacher flourished. But beneath the surface, Hill's growing authority allowed him to cultivate a dangerous sense of entitlement. The trust of his congregants became a tool, and the boundaries between pastoral care and personal gain began to blur. The first signs of impropriety were subtle and often hidden behind layers of religious rhetoric. Hill began to solicit donations under the guise of charitable work, promising divine favor or spiritual rewards for contributions. Families and congregants, motivated by faith and trust, complied without question. As his influence grew, so did the complexity of his schemes. He created multiple fundraising programs, including divine investment plans, claiming that money given to the church would be multiplied by God's blessing. But in reality, Hill diverted funds to personal accounts, luxurious properties, and a lifestyle far beyond the modest means of his followers. Over time, Hill's financial misconduct became more elaborate. He forged documents, manipulated church accounting, and exerted psychological pressure on congregants to contribute more than they could afford. Church elders who questioned his methods were intimidated, silenced, or subtly removed from leadership. Hill's control over the church was near absolute. He had created an ecosystem where dissent was discouraged, where the moral authority of the pastor overshadowed the ethical responsibility of oversight, and where fear, faith, and loyalty were weaponized to maintain compliance. The crimes escalated beyond financial exploitation. Hill began engaging in sexual misconduct, targeting vulnerable members of his congregation, often minors or young adults. Using a combination of charisma, manipulation, and religious authority, he groomed victims over months, sometimes years. He convinced them that submission was a spiritual duty, that refusal would lead to divine punishment, and that their trust in him was a sacred covenant. The abuse was methodical, deliberate, and calculated to silence and control. In the early 2000s, law enforcement began investigating Hill following anonymous tips and a courageous report from a victim who had escaped his influence. Investigators found a trove of evidence, including financial records demonstrating years of embezzlement, personal accounts documenting coerced contributions, and extensive digital and physical evidence of sexual abuse. Interviews with former congregants painted a harrowing picture of manipulation, fear, and betrayal, confirming suspicions of a long-term pattern of predatory behavior. The trial was a high-profile event, drawing national attention due to the combination of religious authority and criminal behavior. Prosecutors presented extensive documentation of financial fraud, including falsified receipts, bank records showing misappropriation of donations, and personal expenses funded by church money. Witnesses recounted the psychological tactics Hill used to maintain control, describing threats of spiritual consequences, isolation, and emotional manipulation. Victims detailed the sexual abuse they endured, painting a vivid and chilling portrait of betrayal by a man they had trusted implicitly. Hill's defense argued that he had acted in good faith, that the financial mismanagement was a result of poor accounting rather than fraud, and that allegations of sexual misconduct were exaggerated or fabricated. However, the weight of evidence, documentary, testimonial, and digital overwhelmed the defense. The jury deliberated for several days before returning a verdict of guilty on multiple counts of financial fraud and sexual abuse. Hill was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, reflecting the severity and multiplicity of his crimes. The ruling sent shockwaves through his former congregation, the local community, and the broader religious landscape. Families who had trusted Hill were left grappling with the duality of his persona: the charismatic pastor who offered hope and guidance, and the manipulative predator who exploited faith for personal gain. The church he had built disbanded, leaving behind a legacy of shattered trust and deep emotional scars. The aftermath of Hill's crimes extended far beyond the courtroom. Survivors struggled with trauma, grappling with betrayal, fear, and long-term psychological impact. Financial restitution helped some recover material losses, but the emotional toll remained profound. Communities began implementing stricter oversight, mandatory reporting, and financial auditing in religious organizations to prevent similar abuses of power. Counseling and support groups became essential for healing, not only for direct victims, but also for congregants who had trusted him for decades. Gerald H. Hill's story remains a chilling reminder of the potential for corruption within positions of trust. His life illustrates how charisma, authority, and the veneer of morality can mask manipulation, abuse, and criminal activity. His crimes highlight the importance of vigilance, transparency, and accountability in institutions that wield moral and spiritual influence. The reflection left by Hill's story is stark. How can communities protect themselves when those entrusted with spiritual guidance exploit the very faith they claim to uphold? How can belief be safeguarded from abuse? And what measures ensure that the shepherd does not become the predator? Even today, Hill's former parishioners continue to grapple with the legacy of his betrayal, serving as a somber lesson that trust, once exploited, can leave wounds that last generations. His case underscores the chilling reality that the intersection of faith and authority can become a dangerous terrain when unchecked by accountability, ethics, or oversight. Bishop Thomas Weeks' story is a harrowing example of how faith, influence, and authority can be twisted into tools for manipulation and abuse. Born in the 1940s in Georgia, Weeks grew up in a devout family, steeped in church life and religious tradition. From an early age, he displayed a natural charisma, a commanding presence, and a desire to lead others. Church elders noted his oratory skills, his ability to inspire congregations, and his instinct for organizing community initiatives. Many believed he was destined for spiritual leadership, perhaps even greatness within the religious community. Weeks began preaching in local churches as a teenager, gaining early recognition for his eloquence and conviction. His sermons were filled with passion, often focusing on morality, sin, and the eternal consequences of one's actions. Congregants described him as magnetic, someone whose words could move an entire room, someone who seemed to hold the power to transform lives through faith. This natural talent propelled him quickly through the ranks of regional ministries, eventually earning him the title of bishop. With the title came authority, wealth, and a platform that extended far beyond the small churches where he began his career. As bishop, Weeks expanded his influence. He established multiple congregations, oversaw charitable programs, and presented himself as a moral exemplar. To outsiders, his life appeared devoted entirely to service. He was a pillar of the community, a frequent speaker at interfaith events, and a trusted advisor to local leaders. Families trusted him implicitly, believing he would never misuse his spiritual authority. However, behind the facade, Weeks' behavior began to reveal troubling patterns. He became increasingly controlling, insisting on absolute obedience from his staff and congregants. He established rigid rules that regulated not only church activities, but also the private lives of his followers. Young women in the congregation were singled out for special attention, often under the guise of mentorship or spiritual guidance. Weeks leveraged his position to isolate these individuals from their families and peers, creating a system in which questioning his authority equated to defying God himself. The first reports of misconduct were subtle, often dismissed as rumor or misinterpretation. Staff members noticed Weeks' inappropriate attention to certain female congregants, the insistence on private meetings, and the use of spiritual rhetoric to justify extended one-on-one interactions. Teenagers described feeling intimidated and manipulated, yet fear and reverence prevented most from speaking out. Weeks was careful, meticulous, and persuasive, using scripture and theological arguments to rationalize behavior that was predatory and abusive. Over the years, Weeks escalated his misconduct. He began engaging in sexual abuse, often targeting minors or vulnerable young women within his congregations. Victims later recounted that he would frame compliance as a sacred duty, claiming that refusal would anger God or jeopardize their salvation. The abuse was not sporadic but systematic, covering decades and affecting multiple victims. Weeks' cunning lay not only in the abuse itself, but in the psychological manipulation surrounding it. He created an environment in which victims doubted their perception of reality, feared retaliation, and felt spiritually obligated to obey. Weeks' financial dealings were equally troubling. Donations from congregants intended for charitable causes were often misappropriated to fund his luxurious lifestyle, including expensive homes, vehicles, and travel. He justified these expenditures as divinely sanctioned, claiming that his personal comfort was a reward for fulfilling God's work. Church leaders who questioned these expenditures were silenced or replaced, consolidating his power further. By the early 2000s, Weeks had established a sophisticated system of controlled spiritual authority. Financial manipulation and fear combined to maintain his dominion. The breakthrough came when a courageous former congregant went public, detailing years of abuse and financial misconduct. Law enforcement began a thorough investigation, uncovering evidence that spanned decades. Witnesses came forward, including victims and former staff, providing testimony about sexual abuse, coercion, and financial fraud. Investigators discovered hidden accounts, fraudulent donation schemes, and documented patterns of grooming and exploitation. Weeks' carefully curated public persona crumbled under the weight of these revelations. During the trial, the courtroom was tense, filled with media, survivors, and supporters who struggled to reconcile the public image of the bishop with the documented abuses. Prosecutors presented a meticulously detailed case, including financial records, victim testimony, and witness accounts of Weeks' manipulative tactics. The jury heard stories of psychological terror, sexual exploitation, and financial betrayal, all masked by Weeks' religious authority. The defense attempted to argue that Weeks was a devoted spiritual leader misunderstood by disgruntled congregants, but the evidence was overwhelming. Weeks was convicted on multiple counts of sexual abuse, financial fraud, and misconduct in a position of trust. His sentence included decades in federal prison, reflecting the severity of his crimes and the calculated manner in which he exploited his power. Families and communities were left grappling with the emotional fallout. The congregations he had led dissolved, survivors struggled with long-term trauma, and trust in local religious institutions was profoundly shaken. The aftermath of Weeks' crimes revealed the deep, lingering impact of betrayal. Survivors faced years of counseling, emotional recovery, and societal reintegration. Families had to confront the duality of worship and abuse, reconciling memories of spiritual guidance with the harsh reality of predation. Church oversight mechanisms were revised, new policies were implemented, and public awareness about abuse in religious contexts increased. The legacy of Bishop Thomas Weeks is a cautionary tale about the misuse of spiritual authority. His story demonstrates the danger when faith is weaponized, when power is unchecked, and when communities fail to hold leaders accountable. His life serves as a stark reminder that charisma, moral authority, and religious trust can conceal devastating acts of abuse and corruption. The reflection left by Weeks' story is chilling. How can believers discern true spiritual guidance from manipulation? How do communities safeguard themselves against leaders who use faith as a tool for control and exploitation? And how many lives are quietly shattered while piety is exploited for personal gain? Even today, survivors and communities affected by Weeks' crimes continue to navigate the long path toward healing. His story remains a stark warning. The combination of trust, authority, and isolation can create fertile ground for abuse, and vigilance is the only defense against those who exploit it. Dean Fayello's story is one of a man who cloaked deception in the garb of faith, ultimately crossing the boundary from religious authority into criminal infamy. Born in 1959 in New Jersey, Fayello grew up in an unremarkable middle-class household. Early on, he displayed an aptitude for communication and persuasion, coupled with a fascination for authority figures and the power they wielded. Though his family emphasized honesty and integrity, Fayello's personality gravitated toward control, secrecy, and the pursuit of influence traits that would later define the dark chapters of his life. Fayello's early career seemed innocuous. He dabbled in various jobs, from small business ventures to technical trades, but none offered the sense of power or recognition he craved. In his 20s, he gravitated toward religious circles, attracted by the influence clergy wielded and the respect accorded to spiritual leaders. He began attending church leadership courses, studying theology superficially, and presenting himself as a man of God. People were drawn to his confidence, his calm demeanor, and his ability to explain complex ideas in a compelling way. Soon, he had positioned himself as a spiritual guide within his local community. By the 1980s, Fayello had fully assumed the role of a pastor. He founded small congregations, conducted services, and gained a following among individuals seeking guidance, healing, and solace. Parishioners described him as attentive, empathetic, and charismatic. He offered counseling sessions, prayers for healing, and promises of spiritual breakthroughs, all of which drew more followers into his orbit. He appeared to be a man committed to God and community, a shepherd guiding his flock through a chaotic world. Yet beneath the pastoral persona lay a darker ambition. Fayello had an intense interest in medicine and anatomy, though he lacked formal medical training. Using his role as a trusted religious advisor, he began offering unlicensed cosmetic procedures to congregants and acquaintances, claiming divine approval or special insight into the human body. Initially, these were minor procedures, injections, minor alterations, and non-invasive treatments. Many clients trusted him implicitly, believing that a man of God would not cause harm. Over time, Fayello's procedures became riskier and more elaborate. He operated without licenses, training, or proper equipment, often using his victims' trust as a shield against suspicion. Financially, the procedures were lucrative, and the secrecy surrounding his operations made it difficult for authorities to intervene. Patients were drawn by Fayello's reputation, his religious authority, and the promise of spiritual and physical healing. He exploited this trust to commit acts that endangered and ultimately destroyed lives. The pivotal event in Fayello's criminal trajectory occurred in 2001, when a client named Maria Cruz sought an injection to improve her appearance. Fayello administered the procedure in his apartment without medical oversight or proper sanitation. Cruz soon began experiencing severe complications. Fayello, fearing exposure and legal consequences, panicked. Rather than seeking help, he drugged her, wrapped her body, and attempted to conceal her death. He eventually transported the corpse, abandoning it in a vacant lot in New York. The discovery of Cruz's body triggered a federal investigation that would unravel Fayello's elaborate web of deception. Authorities traced evidence back to his apartment, including medical instruments, records of unlicensed procedures, and correspondence with clients. Former congregants and patients came forward, revealing the dual life Fayello had maintained: pastor, spiritual guide, and unlicensed practitioner. Witnesses described his charm, religious authority, and ability to manipulate trust, which allowed him to operate undetected for years. During the trial, prosecutors painted a chilling portrait of Fayello as a man who weaponized faith to gain control, both emotionally and physically, over his victims. They detailed his history of unlicensed procedures, deception, and ultimately, the deliberate concealment of a client's death. The courtroom heard testimony from surviving victims, family members of Maria Cruz, and law enforcement investigators who painstakingly reconstructed Fayello's activities. Fayello's defense attempted to argue negligence rather than intentional malice. They claimed he acted out of ignorance and panic, rather than a deliberate intent to harm. However, the premeditation, deception, and prolonged history of unlicensed procedures undermined these claims. The jury considered not only the act that led to Cruz's death, but also the systemic pattern of exploitation, manipulation, and abuse of trust that characterized Fayello's career. In 2006, Dean Fayello was convicted of manslaughter and practicing medicine without a license. He received a lengthy prison sentence, reflecting both the fatal consequences of his actions and the betrayal of the trust placed in him by clients and congregants. His imprisonment marked the end of his dual life but left a lasting scar on the community, victims, and families affected by his actions. The aftermath was complex. Survivors struggled with feelings of betrayal, fear, and loss. The duality of Fayello's life pastor and predator complicated emotional recovery, leaving many to question the nature of trust, authority, and the thin line between spiritual guidance and exploitation. Communities implemented stricter oversight of religious leaders who engaged in non-traditional services, emphasizing transparency, accountability, and the separation of spiritual counsel from unlicensed medical practices. The legacy of Dean Fayello's story is a cautionary tale of faith manipulated, authority abused, and trust exploited. His life demonstrates how charisma, religious authority, and the promise of spiritual or physical healing can conceal predatory behavior. It underscores the importance of vigilance, verification, and the need for mechanisms that protect individuals from those who misuse positions of influence. The reflection left by Fayolo's story is haunting. How can one discern the genuine healer from the deceiver when trust and faith are used as shields? How many lives are endangered when authority goes unchecked, and how easily can devotion blind judgment? Even years after his conviction, Fayolo's case serves as a stark warning. The most comforting facades may conceal the most dangerous realities, and faith, when manipulated, can become a weapon as lethal as any physical force. Arthur Schirmer's story is a haunting example of how spiritual authority can be warped into a weapon of control and exploitation. Born in 1948 in Ohio, Schirmer grew up in a devout Lutheran household, where church attendance, Bible study, and strict adherence to religious principles shaped every aspect of his early life. From a young age, he displayed intelligence, eloquence, and an unusual ability to command attention, traits that would later cement his rise in the religious community. Family and friends noted his charisma and a precocious understanding of theology, often marveling at his capacity to explain complex spiritual concepts with clarity and passion. Schirmer pursued a conventional path toward the ministry. After high school, he attended a Lutheran seminary, excelling academically and socially. He developed a reputation for being persuasive, articulate, and deeply committed to what he presented as moral and spiritual leadership. His early sermons, focused on sin, redemption, and moral accountability, attracted large congregations, particularly among families seeking guidance and reassurance in turbulent times. By the late 1970s, Schirmer had established himself as a respected pastor, rising through the church hierarchy and becoming known for his ability to inspire and maintain loyalty among his followers. From the outside, Schirmer's life appeared exemplary. He was married with children, led charitable initiatives, and was a visible presence in the community. Parents and congregants alike trusted him implicitly. He was the kind of pastor who seemed to embody the values he preached, someone who could be relied upon for guidance, counsel, and spiritual care. His charisma was magnetic, creating a halo effect that made questioning him seem both socially and spiritually unacceptable. Yet beneath this veneer of piety lay a deeply manipulative and predatory personality. Schirmer's initial transgressions were subtle. He began offering private counseling sessions to young congregants, presenting them as opportunities for spiritual growth. Behind closed doors, these sessions became venues for psychological manipulation and grooming. He exploited his position of trust to isolate victims, using fear, guilt, and scripture to coerce compliance. Victims later described a calculated pattern: charm and reassurance initially, followed by gradual sexual exploitation justified as spiritual duty or divine favor. Schirmer's abuse was methodical and long-term. Over the course of a decade, he targeted dozens of young women and teens within his congregations. His approach relied on cultivating dependency, creating an environment in which questioning or resisting him was framed as sinful. He instructed victims to keep their interactions secret, warning them that exposure would bring divine wrath or social ruin. His manipulations extended beyond the immediate victims. Families, staff, and congregants were subtly coerced into complicity or silence, creating a protective shield that allowed his predation to continue undetected. The first public allegations arose in the early 1990s when a former congregant courageously reported inappropriate behavior to law enforcement. Investigators quickly uncovered a pattern of sexual abuse, coercion, and psychological manipulation. The evidence was extensive: detailed victim testimony, corroborating statements from former staff, and documentation of counseling sessions that had been weaponized for abuse. Authorities discovered that Schirmer had maintained meticulous records, both digital and handwritten, of his predatory actions, demonstrating a chilling premeditation and awareness of the criminal nature of his conduct. The trial was a tense and highly publicized affair. Prosecutors presented a meticulous narrative, describing Schirmer's manipulation, abuse, and exploitation in painstaking detail. Victims recounted their experiences, detailing the gradual grooming, psychological coercion, and long-term trauma inflicted by a man they had once trusted implicitly. Witnesses described Schirmer's charm, persuasive rhetoric, and ability to maintain a facade of moral authority even as he violated the most fundamental trust of those under his care. Schirmer's defense attempted to argue that his actions were misinterpreted, that counseling sessions were intended for spiritual guidance, and that allegations were the product of misunderstanding or resentment. However, The weight of evidence, combined with the consistency and specificity of victim testimony, rendered these defenses ineffective. The jury was presented with an undeniable pattern of predatory behavior, masked by the authority of the pulpit. In 1995, Schirmer was convicted on multiple counts of sexual abuse and exploitation of minors. He received a lengthy prison sentence, reflecting both the severity of his crimes and the calculated manner in which he maintained control over his victims. The verdict sent shockwaves through the religious community and the broader public, shattering the image of an impeccable spiritual leader and exposing the dark potential of unchecked authority. The aftermath was devastating for survivors and their families. Victims faced profound psychological trauma, struggling with feelings of betrayal, shame, and fear. Counseling and therapy became essential tools for healing, but the scars, both emotional and spiritual, persisted. Communities that had once placed absolute trust in Schirmer's guidance were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that faith could be weaponized, and that charisma and religious authority could mask the most destructive behavior. Schirmer's case prompted broader conversations about safeguarding mechanisms within religious institutions. Churches and seminaries implemented stricter oversight, including mandatory reporting of abuse, background checks for clergy, and independent auditing of counseling practices. Survivors became advocates for accountability, ensuring that the lessons of Schirmer's predation would inform policies designed to protect vulnerable congregants. The story of Arthur Schirmer leaves a chilling reflection. How can one discern genuine spiritual leadership from predation when charisma and authority create a cloak of trust? How many lives can be quietly shattered before institutions intervene? And how can communities prevent the exploitation of faith for personal gain? Even decades later, survivors continue to rebuild their lives, navigating the emotional aftermath and reclaiming agency over their faith and trust. Schirmer's legacy remains a sobering reminder of the dangers inherent when spiritual authority is misused, demonstrating the critical need for vigilance, transparency, and ethical accountability within religious institutions. William Levin's story is one that reveals the darkest potential of unchecked charisma, religious authority, and moral hypocrisy. Born in 1962 in Pennsylvania, Levin grew up in a devout Jewish Christian household, where faith, morality, and the pursuit of righteousness were central to daily life. From an early age, he exhibited intelligence, charm, and a rare ability to captivate those around him. Teachers described him as articulate, persuasive, and confident beyond his years. His parents, proud of his spiritual inclinations, encouraged a path toward leadership within religious communities. By his late teens, Levin had taken an interest in religious studies, seeking both to understand Scripture and to gain influence over others. He entered seminary, quickly distinguishing himself with his public speaking, theological insights, and magnetic presence. Fellow students and faculty admired his ability to inspire faith in others, to connect with congregants, and to cultivate a sense of trust and reverence. These early years reinforced a belief that he was destined for leadership, that his voice carried divine authority, and that others were meant to follow him. Levin's rise within the religious world was rapid. By his mid-20s, he had assumed the role of pastor at a growing congregation in suburban Pennsylvania. He was known for his eloquent sermons, compassion toward congregants, and community outreach initiatives. Parents trusted him with their children. Families sought his guidance during times of crisis, and his congregation expanded steadily. On the surface, Levin's life reflected everything a devout religious leader was meant to embody: moral integrity, selflessness, and dedication to service. However, beneath this carefully maintained facade, Levin lived a dual life. While preaching morality and spiritual devotion on the pulpit, he engaged in criminal behavior that would ultimately shock the community. Financial mismanagement and embezzlement marked the first cracks in his veneer of integrity. Levin manipulated church funds for personal gain, diverting donations intended for charity and community services into private accounts and lavish purchases. His persuasive charm ensured that few questioned his actions, and he used religious rhetoric to rationalize his financial misconduct. Levin's deception escalated beyond financial crimes. He engaged in sexual misconduct, preying on vulnerable members of his congregation. Victims later described a systematic process of grooming. He would identify those who were isolated, struggling, or seeking spiritual guidance, then offer personal mentorship that quickly became coercive and exploitative. Levin used his position of spiritual authority to intimidate victims, convincing them that refusal would result in divine punishment or social ostracism. Many victims remained silent for years, fearing retaliation and trusting the image of morality Levin projected. His criminal activities were not limited to abuse of congregants. Investigators discovered a network of illicit dealings that included fraud, manipulation of legal documents, and the distribution of unlicensed material. Levin carefully maintained a public image that deflected suspicion. Charity events, church fundraisers, and community programs served as smokescreens for the broader pattern of deception and exploitation. To the outside world, Levin remained a pillar of the community, a man of God whose life exemplified faith and service. The turning point came in the early 2010s when a former congregant bravely reported his abuses to local authorities. Investigators began to uncover a pattern of misconduct that spanned decades. Financial audits revealed significant embezzlement, including diversion of donations to personal accounts, luxury purchases, and hidden assets. Victims came forward, recounting years of manipulation, coercion, and sexual exploitation. The evidence painted a disturbing portrait of a man who had weaponized faith to serve personal desire, greed, and control. During the trial, the courtroom became a stage for the dramatic collision of perception and reality. Survivors detailed the insidious grooming, emotional manipulation, and abuse of authority. Witnesses provided testimony on financial malfeasance, demonstrating how Levin had exploited congregational trust for decades. The prosecution emphasized the deliberate and premeditated nature of his actions, highlighting the way he maintained a facade of religious devotion while engaging in repeated criminal acts. Levin's defense attempted to downplay the severity of his crimes, framing them as misunderstandings or lapses in judgment. They argued that financial discrepancies were clerical errors and that allegations of abuse were either exaggerated or However, the extensive documentation of his dual life, coupled with consistent and corroborated testimony from multiple victims, rendered these defenses ineffective. The jury deliberated and returned a conviction on multiple counts, including embezzlement, sexual abuse, and fraud. Levin was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. The sentence reflected not only the tangible harm caused to victims and financial institutions, but also the profound betrayal of spiritual trust. His congregation, once loyal and thriving, fractured in the aftermath. Families faced the daunting task of reconciling faith with betrayal, struggling to understand how a man of God could orchestrate such extensive harm. Many former congregants left organized religion entirely, shaken by the duality of leadership and deception they had witnessed. The long-term impact of Levin's crimes extended far beyond legal consequences. Survivors required years of therapy and emotional recovery, confronting feelings of shame, guilt, and violation. Families had to navigate the societal and spiritual implications of betrayal by a trusted leader. Communities implemented stricter oversight of religious institutions, creating mechanisms for accountability, financial auditing, and mandatory reporting of misconduct to prevent similar abuses in the future. Levin's story underscores the danger of unchecked spiritual authority and the destructive potential of charismatic leadership when wielded unethically. It is a chilling reminder that faith, trust, and admiration can be manipulated to conceal greed, abuse, and predation. The reflection left by William Levin's story is sobering. How can one reconcile faith with betrayal? How can communities discern the shepherd from the deceiver when charisma and authority mask predation? And how many lives can be quietly harmed under the guise of spiritual guidance before intervention occurs? Even years after his conviction, the consequences of Levin's crimes continue to reverberate. His case serves as a lasting warning about the perils of blind trust in religious authority and the necessity of vigilance, transparency, and ethical accountability within institutions of faith. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.